Welcome. My name is Algey Stambuk. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. It is my pleasure today to join with you in the World Affairs Council Distinguished Speaker Series. We're joined by General Retired Curtis M. Scaparrotti and with Clint Work from the Stimson Center, our partner for today, and 38 North. The topic that we have today is it's not just over there, the American commitment to the Korean Peninsula. As you know, the World Affairs Council is the community's premier global education nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We're delighted to have you all with us today, and it's going to be a very, very interesting program. I do want to share with you that this program is being recorded, and we will share with you once we have the program edited and prepared. Please make sure that you have a correct email address so we can send it to you in due time. It is my pleasure now to introduce to you Dr. Curtis Work. And let me find the background information in a second. And here we have it. Dr. Clint Work is a fellow with the Henry L. Stimson Center appointed to Security for a New Century program in 38 North. In this capacity, Dr. Work leads congressional engagement on Korean peace and security issues and engages in various research projects centered on U.S. Democratic People's Republic Korea relations and the U.S. Republic of Korea alliance. Prior to joining Stimson, he was an assistant professor at the University of Utah's Asia campus in Incheon, South Korea, where he taught courses on the Korean War and international relations. He holds a doctorate in international studies from the University of Washington, a master's in international relations from the University of Chicago, and a BA in political science and philosophy from Boston College. His PhD work centered on US-Korea relations and President Jimmy Carter's failed withdrawal of US combat troop forces from South Korea. In addition to his academic publications, he has written for popular media, including the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, The Diplomat Magazine, 38 North, and Sino-NK. He has presented on US-Korea relations in both public and academic fora, as well as briefed congressional staff on a bipartisan basis. I present to you Dr. Clint Work. Clint.
Thank you very much for that introduction, LJ. And thank you to you, Jesse Herman, and the entire World Affairs Council of Charlotte for your partnership on this timely and important event. Today's webinar is part of the Stimson Center and its 38 North program's state and congressional district outreach on Korean peace and security issues. And as originally conceived, this involved us traveling throughout the country and holding in-person events. But for obvious reasons, we've had to call an audible and adapt in how we carried programming to various locales. And the World Affairs Council of Charlotte was a natural partner in this virtual adaptation process. And fortunately, their wonderful outreach efforts have resulted in a very nice mix of folks from Charlotte and from the state of North Carolina as a whole. So we've managed to hew close to a local feel despite the virtual nature of the event. Now, as the title of our program suggests, a key message we hope to convey is that the US connection to the Korean Peninsula is not just over there, but that it links directly to the United States and really is as important today as it's ever been. In some states and congressional districts, this can be a difficult argument to make. However, North Carolina has several important links to the Korean Peninsula. First and foremost, 805 North Carolinians gave their lives during the Korean War. And in the nearly 7 decades since, thousands more have been stationed and served in South Korea. Additionally, North Carolina's military bases have both historical and contemporary links to the Korean Peninsula. For example, in 1968, 3 airborne infantry battalions from the 82nd Airborne Division based at Fort Bragg flew 31 hours nonstop from North Carolina to drop south of the Han River in a show of just how quickly the US could respond to a Korean contingency. More recently, the roughly 400-person 1st Squadron of the 17th Cavalry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne completed a rotation in South Korea, providing aviation support to the US mission there. But North Carolina also has important non-military links to the Korean Peninsula as well. The state exports 1.1 billion in goods and services to South Korea, which make up 8% of its exports to the region as a whole, and results in the creation of roughly 6,500 jobs in the state. Multiple major Korean companies invest in the state, including Hyundai, the Hyosung Group, and the Kumho Asiana Corporation, to name a few. And quite importantly, over 27,000 Korean Americans call the state their home. In sum, there are many important and enduring connections between North Carolina, the United States, and the Korean Peninsula. So it's in the spirit of that connection that we've organized today's program alongside the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. And I really don't think we could have arranged a better featured speaker in General Curtis Scaparrotti to headline the event. In 2019, General Scaparrotti completed a distinguished 41-year career in the US Army as the commander of US-European Command and Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, or NATO. Prior to General Scaparrotti's leadership role at NATO and in US-European Command, he served as the commander of US Forces Korea, United Nations Command, and Combined Forces Command in South Korea from 2013 to 2016. Indeed, he's one of only 2 US generals ever to have commanded US forces in Korea and then in Europe, which gives him a great comparative vantage point on our 2 most institutionalized and interoperable bilateral and multilateral alliances, respectively. He's also served as the director of the Joint Staff, commander of the International Security Assistance Force, the deputy commander of US Forces Afghanistan, the commanding general of First Corps and Joint Base Lewis McChord, and of course, as the commanding general of the aforementioned 82nd Airborne Division based at Fort Bragg. Additionally, over the years, he served in numerous key leadership positions at the tactical, operational, and strategic level of the US military, and is the recipient of numerous awards and decorations. So we're exceedingly pleased to have him join us today. And the format of today's program is as follows. General Scaparrotti and I will engage in sort of a semi-structured conversation for the first half, at which point we will then turn to audience Q&A. And just a few housekeeping notes, we have the Q&A function already open. So if there are questions that arise as we go through our discussion, please feel free to enter them there and we'll queue them up. I do ask, though, that you make them as concise as possible, 1 to 2 sentences tops, and we will get to them as best we can. So without further ado, I want to turn to the first question that I've prepared. And as you well know, General Scaparrotti, generally speaking, the underlying mission of US forces in South Korea is often characterized as deterring North Korea and then assisting in the defense of South Korea in the case that deterrence fails. However, this really does sound like the US mission and commitment is indeed over there. Why then should Americans and North Carolinians in particular care what happens on the Korean Peninsula? You're still muted, General.
Okay, let's try it again. I just want to say to you, thank you for the invitation to speak to the Global Affairs here in Charlotte, and thank the Stimson Center, 38 North, and the Global Affairs Council for the support of this. It's a privilege to talk to you today. So why should we care? I think, Dr. Work, you started with a very good opening to that question, and that is that it's just not over there. It has direct connections to us. You talked about the North Carolinian economy and the connections there, but you know, the U.S. is Republic of Korea's second largest trade partner. They're our 6th. Within the Pacific, 60% of the global trade, GDP, goes through that area. It is connected, and we live in a connected world. So first of all, stability on the peninsula is paramount. And if there were not stability, we'd feel it. It would be not only a regional conflict, but it would have global impact very quickly. Second, I think is that, you know, we have a mutual defense treaty with them. We don't have one of those with a lot of countries, but we do have one with the Republic of Korea. And of course, we've got to be credible and respond to those defense treaties as a good ally would. The ally that we have in the Republic of Korea is a long and great one. This alliance is historic. It's almost 70 years now, and it is one where we came together because of the shedding of blood together to protect the Republic of Korea. And it has been intact since that time. So this is an ally that's very strong, and I'll talk about in some other ways a bit later how strong they are. But it's one that we have to be credible as an ally as well and come to their defense if need be. I've mentioned the economic one. The last one I'll mention is strategic ties. And that is that there are vital American interests beyond the economy as well. And that is our strategy within the greater Pacific, the Indo-Pacific. Korea sits in a strategic place. That node is important to us. And it is also a part of the network that allows us and other nations to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I'll just stop there for brevity, but we might get into that a bit later.
Thank you, General. Yeah, you point out a really sort of salient fact that whenever you think about the Korean Peninsula, it's impossible not to then think about, in the case of any contingency, the regional and global effects that almost immediately arise as this key node. Speaking to potential contingencies, I wanted to ask, the phrase "all options are on the table" is often used during times of high tension, such as in 2017. But there's always considerable pushback on the idea of the use of force against North Korea in such instances, despite all of its rogue behavior and provocations. So why do you think this is? And are military options or responses to North Korea's WMD ambitions really a viable option?
Well, I think they are a viable option. There's obviously one we can't take off the table. We have, the enemy gets a vote in this. And as you know, North Korea votes fairly frequently. Yeah, just one of the things about becoming a commander there, obviously you go back and you talk to the prior commanders. And the consistent message I got from the commanders prior to me taking over in Korea is be ready, you will be tested. And I was. We had several crises in the 3 years that I was there. One in August of 2015 that we were very close to conflict. And so that's the first thing I would say to you. The second is, though, having been the commander there, is I am a strong supporter of finding other options beyond military options to bring this to resolution, to actually conclude the armistice, find peace on the peninsula. Simply because what you have there is you have the fourth largest army in North Korea, fourth largest military in North Korea, 1.2 million. Arrayed actually in tactical positions. They're actually forward. They have their supplies forward. They have much of what they need forward as if they were going to attack. In defended positions, it's been built up over years with thousands of artillery pieces that can reach Seoul, thousands of ballistic missiles, short range and medium range, that can affect South Korea and the region. A very large chemical stockpile. 4 or 5 years ago, it was the second largest in the world. It's maybe the largest now, but it's certainly in the top 3 or 4. And as you know, with a doctrine, it says they'll use it. So Seoul, their largest city, holds half of their population, 25 million people in Seoul, 5 times the density of New York City, all within artillery range. You could see what that would be like. I mean, it would be a horrific, high intensity conflict. And we need to find a way to avoid that. That's the bottom line. North Korea, some estimates are that they could fire 200,000 rounds in an hour into the capital of South Korea. So this is a very dangerous foe that we have, and we need to be ready. And for that reason, everything's on the table. With a nuclear-armed North Korea.
That's a great point that I often have in a conversation with friends and family who ask me about Korea and the North Korean threat these days. It's, we may look at it as a strategic threat now, as something that could reach potentially the U.S. mainland. Seoulites and South Koreans, of course, have been living with this for decades. It is their existence. So thinking a little bit about where we are today, there's a lot of speculation about what may or may not happen before the election or just after the election, depending on its outcome. Currently, U.S. DPRK relations are somewhere between the fire and fury of 2017 and the hopeful and historic diplomacy of 2018 and early 2019. Where do you see events trending in the coming months? And as best we can tell, what are North Korea's intentions? It's always a difficult question to ask, or to answer rather. We've touched on some of the factors that complicate and hinder US and alliance policy in response. What complicates and hinders Kim Jong-un's calculations and North Korea's policy decisions?
Yeah. So great question. I mean, first of all, I happen to think that we were making some progress post 2017 in terms of this maximum pressure campaign. I don't think that Kim Jong-un came to the negotiation table out of his, just out of some desire to have peace. I think he was in pretty dire straits at the time and determined he needed to do that. And he reached out to China as well, which he had not done prior to that time since he had become the leader. So I think we were making some progress. Well, I think there's obviously this stalled after the negotiations. And so now I think it appears to me we're back to the normal cycle of provocation by North Korea. They've returned to that. They sent a very, I think, clear signal with the destruction of the liaison headquarters to South Korea. They've said that they will not denuclearize. That won't be a part of the negotiations if they were to start again. Seoul's policy of détente is not making progress. Obviously, the destruction of that liaison building was a signal to say that is ended as far as Kim Jong-un was concerned. And so, both the U.S. and South Korea are a bit of a stall, and North Korea has said that they're returning to the status quo, essentially, which they're very good at, as you know, over time. So I think at least in the coming months, we're going to see much of the same as we have in the past. Also set in the context of we have an election coming up. I think that has an impact on everybody's thinking, to include North Korea's, Kim Jong-un's. And then secondly, a year from that, you have South Korea's election coming up. So all those things are a factor in the timing of, say, another approach to try and resolve this, again. What does North Korea have to deal with? He does have some real problems, Kim Jong-un. First of all, he has a very, very strained economy, made worse because of sanctions, and an economy that relies on China for 95% of his trade and what money he does exchange. The rest of that is black market for the most part. And so he's got a very strained economy. And the COVID has actually made it much worse. COVID has done what we have not been able to do in sanctions, essentially cut off his borders and make it very difficult for him to trade and to run an economy. I think North Korea is in much more dire straits than perhaps we comprehend at this point in time. And that too, I think, might have been part of the act to blow up the building here recently. It had a domestic purpose, perhaps, as well. And then finally, as you look at Kim Jong-un's position, he always has to keep three things in check. One is he has to keep the regime loyal. That's how he stays in power. Two, he has to control the information because as a dynasty, as a Kim dynasty, he has to continue that line. He has to continue to control the information that his people know. And he also has to keep the army and his defense strong enough to keep him in place and to deter, from his perspective, what he sees as his enemy or his challengers. And those are, he has a poor hand to play. My perspective, I took over right after he assumed the leader there. And, if you remember in the early part, Dr. Wood, there was talk about, is he capable? Is he a rogue? Is he rational? I think you'd probably agree he's really developed his capabilities in leading that country and his ability to play the politics over this time period more than I predicted he would when I first began in my tour there.
Thank you, General. Yeah, this is this is also constantly a question: is the leadership rational? Are they crazy? My standard response is they're actually quite rational, indeed hyper rational, in large part because of the constrained conditions you outlined. They can be both, horrible human rights abusers, but still highly rational at the same time, which I think is sometimes difficult for folks to square.
What I'd mention, I'd like to, your insight on this would be interesting, but while I was there, I met with, North Korean defectors, et cetera, pretty regularly. And when it comes to the rationality of the leader and North Korea, what I'm concerned about is their perspective, their worldview. I'm not sure it is accurate. They're rational within that, but I'm not sure they have a really clear worldview given the isolation that they impose on themselves and the pressure that Kim Jong-un puts on those who are giving him advice.
Interesting, right? Their own worldview can help foster or exacerbate those very constraints, right? So I want to turn to a question, and this maybe can help us dig a little bit deeper, as you mentioned before, into the alliance. And something that's sort of in the ether these days, a question: does South Korea really need the US military presence there? By now, wouldn't their forces be enough to defend themselves against a North Korean attack?
So, this is a question that comes up frequently, and I have great respect for the Republic of Korea's military, as a military and their individual leadership, which I've come to know well. It's a very modern army, a very modern military, as you said, and they also have a growing and quite good defense industry as a part of that nation, and a 13th largest economy. I would say to you that, that's their goal. Their goal is, in fact, to lead the alliance. And we have an agreement with them to do that when they're ready. I personally don't believe they're ready to do that yet, although they're closing on that target. And that's primarily because of they need to develop specific capabilities in numbers, what we often call enablers, but for instance, communications, command and control, and intelligence, ballistic missile defense systems against a very, a very difficult foe with numbers of both artillery and ballistic missiles, and a developing nuclear capability. And then also just the ability to lead a large joint force. While they're a large force in and of themselves, this would quickly become something that in a full conflict that would be, as you said, potentially regional. And we would look to other allies as well, United Nations Command, perhaps. And so the leadership of a joint and combined force in high intensity conflict is challenging. And that's one that we've got to ensure they're ready for as well. So bottom line is, they need to be ready to take the lead, which they're moving toward now. And even once they take the lead, they'll need the United States just because of the size of the foe and the capability that they have.
Thank you. I think without getting into the nuts and bolts of it, because it's pretty wonky, the issue of the transfer of operational control within the CFC is an interesting one. Some shameless self-promotion. I'll be writing an article on this in the coming week or so, so everyone stay tuned. We'll make sure to broadcast that. Sort of asking a different angle of a question I was alluding to before. What is the value? What is the value in the alliance with the ROK? And what is the value of it to US and US interests? And maybe changing the angle a little bit, what would the US stand to lose if the alliance were severed? Meaning an abrogation of that mutual defense treaty, which you had alluded to before.
Well, first of all, I'll just start generally. If you look at today's security environment globally, return of great power competition, the speed with which technology is changing, I think it's actually changing the character of warfare in a way that we're not quite sure how that's going to come out yet. I don't think anybody is. We no longer are the dominant global power. I mean, we are the dominant one, but not in the ways we were, say, in at the end of the Cold War. where not only were we clearly the dominant power globally, but we were dominant in every domain. We're now being challenged by China and Russia in some ways. And so we need our allies. We need our allies to remain a global power and to ensure that we can ensure a world that is based on the rules-based order that was established after World War II, where you have human rights, you have free trade, you have freedom of the seas and skies. We need our allies, and Iraq is one of our best allies. Secondly, that ally happens to be in a position that's strategically critical to our strategy for those kinds of freedoms in the Pacific. And so we need them there as well. Finally, as I said, they're a special ally. The ROKs they're tenacious. They've got a very good military, and we work well with them. So we learn from our allies as well, and we learn from the ROKs. One of the things I think we have, Americans have to a certain extent, I'm saying this as a senior commander, we've got to be careful that because we were the dominant power, military power for all these years, we tend to think that our way is the only way. And what I learned leading two multinational alliances is that we've got a lot to learn too. And the solution is always better when it's a multinational one. It takes a little more time. There's a little more complexity, but it's a better solution. And for that reason too, we need to, retain our allies. Now, what would happen if we didn't have this alliance? Well, if we didn't have this alliance, I think that one, the deterrence of North Korea would not be nearly as effective. North Korea would be very happy with this. For them to make any progress on what their goals are, North Korea's goals, they have to split this alliance first. And so they would be very happy about that. And third, we would not be able to really execute the kind of strategy that we need to execute globally, because it relies on a network of partners. That's our intent, not only in Pacific, but in Europe as well. It's based on NATO. So we'd lose all of those things. And I think we would certainly lose our ability to, and influence that we have globally today without our allies.
Thank you, General. That was a really comprehensive answer. And this is for our audience. I would point to a book by Dr. Mira Rapp-Hooper, Shields of the Republic, which examines the very questions and points that you brought up about how the U.S. policymakers, lawmakers, and the public, in its understanding, can adjudicate this process of needing allies more than ever, but no longer being still the predominant, but not the dominant power it once was, when these alliances were first formed. And I want to ask another question. This is the one I'm actually most intent to ask you, and then we'll turn to audience Q&A. But it sort of builds on a point you were making, and that's taking in allied perspectives, different allied perspectives in different contexts. So taking a step back, as the former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and Commander of European Command, but also as Commander of US Forces Korea, the UNC, the CFC, you had a very unique experience leading US and allied forces in two of the most crucial regions in the world to US interests. So having served in both, and from such a remarkable vantage point, how would you compare and contrast the two perspectives? And furthermore, did your experience as commander in Korea, in particular working with the multilateral UNC, help prepare you at all for your time as commander in Europe?
Yeah, so, as you look at both commands, I mean, the first thing is that at the level of being the senior military commander, leading the US-ROK alliance, for instance, or NATO, there's a lot more policy than there is military. I mean, you spend most of your day on the political dynamic, the diplomatic dynamic of what you do. It's not that you're still the leader of the military. You're responsible for all those plans. But in order to put those things into place, you realize first off that it's really about the other elements of power, particularly the diplomatic element of power and the economic element of power. And the military just supports that in being effective. So as a commander, what did I learn? I mean, you really are immersed in how the other elements of power work and the role that you play in that. And so coming into that alliance, that was a challenge for me. And in an alliance that is so well established as a ROK-US alliance, it was helpful in the sense that while it is still challenging, it has generally one large problem, and that is North Korea. It is of two nations, with another command that I led called the United Nations Command that had 16 nations in it at the time. And so between those two, you begin to work toward your objectives. So in that, it was complex, but much more focused. The other is because of the length of time that it had been together and its ability to focus, the US-ROK alliance really has some very well-developed diplomatic and decision-making processes, and has a very solid mill-to-mill relationship. Its headquarters, for instance, the Combined Forces headquarters that I commanded, was fully integrated. It was ROK and US side by side. And we had crisis action and response procedures that were not only practiced, but had been used. So leaving that for just a second, then you go to NATO. NATO is much more complex in the sense that it's 28, was 30 nations about the time I left, started out at 28. Therefore, much more complex just by virtue of the different interests that the countries bring to bear on any given problem, and multiple problems. It wasn't just Russia. There was a refugee issue as I took over in 2016. There's a terrorist issue without a doubt. And as I was working my way through those 3 years, China became more and more of a competitor and a security issue within the European theater. So it was much more complex. On the other hand, while it does have decision-making and political and military decision-making processes, I found that those in Korea helped me provide some good ideas and interject some things that we had learned in Korea that we could inject into NATO in terms of a quicker decision-making process, certainly on the military side, the procedures and processes, et cetera, including as it impacted our planning. So I did learn a good deal that helped me as I moved into the SAC-GEAR position and the EUCOM command position, without a doubt. And then finally, I'll just close by saying that deterrence is deterrence. And so I learned a lot about deterrence of North Korea and its aggression that really educated me and helped me refine my thinking on that as I came into deterrence and defense in Europe of Russia, and how we were at that time then rebuilding that within NATO. So I think helpful there as well. So hopefully that answers your question. It's a question you could talk quite a long time on.
I was going to say just that we could spend the whole webinar on exactly that question. I liked how you highlighted just how interoperable the US-ROK alliance is. I think it's something that's lost on a lot of casual observers, is actually just how deeply integrated that alliance is in ways that go beyond, of course, just the military. Well, I want to stay true to the run of show that I laid out and turn to our audience Q&A. I have quite a few of my own questions in tow, just in case we didn't get enough, but we have quite a few. And the first one actually overlaps with a question that I would have asked, and that is that the US and ROK militaries appear to face major challenges, including COVID-19 and stalled cost-sharing talks in maintaining combined defense readiness. One, how can COVID-19 affect the combined defense posture of the alliance? And what could the unintended effect of COVID be on military readiness? And how can the stalled defense cost-sharing talks have short and long-term effects on the US-ROK alliance and the deterrence posture of military forces moving forward?
Yeah, well, first, COVID has had an impact, obviously. It actually had an impact on our ability to train both ROK and US and as an alliance and with our other allies, in order to try and make sure that we kept the force healthy. So first we had to put in place, the processes that ensured the security of the force, put them into quarantine, and then coming out of that, ensure that that we didn't inject someone who was infected into the force. I would tell you that Korea probably has one of the best records globally of handling the pandemic. And US Forces Korea and the Korean force did quite a good job with that as well, in the way that they handled it, the regimen they put in place, and they were able to get back to training. Now, how does it affect that? We got back into training in the US side and the ROK side, but we had to keep it at lower levels. Company level initially, then battalion level. We're beginning to get back into exercises again, but you do that while ensuring the health of the force. The impact could be devastating. I mean, throughout history, there's been armies that have health issues that run rampant and really makes them, combat ineffective. That can happen. And so it has to be something that we pay attention to. And again, I think USFK and the ROK forces, from everything that I've seen, has done a very good job of that. The impact of negotiations. Well, if you have a stalled negotiation like this, then you begin to have things like, what's next? And North Korea has an opening then to make verbal statements, which they did for some days, and take action, like they did in the destruction of the liaison building, and also renewing new missile shots, etc. So as I said, I think we're back to where we were before, and to begin this negotiation again, there has to be some strong diplomatic work to convince all the parties that there is a way forward here and that we need to meet and that we can make progress.
And in terms of the, the US-ROK Special Measures Agreement or cost-sharing talks, that's as yet still not concluded. What harm do you think this could pose if it sort of remains perpetually unfinished and rolls into the election season?
Right.
Or even
well, it's really pretty fundamental. An alliance is built on trust. And, there's within both of the alliances I've read, there's always some political turbulence because each of the nations have their own particular interests. That's always a little common. Good alliances know how to deal with that. And both the ROK, US Alliance, and NATO are good at that aspect of dealing with those policy issues. But it can begin to affect your military to military, alliance and cohesion as well. And that's just real important. My personal opinion is we need to settle this. We need to do it quickly. I was in command at the time that we raised it considerably up to nearly $1 billion. That was a very tough negotiation. I think it was right. I think the ROKs did the right thing at the number that we came to. And at that time, just to tell you how this sets, I mean, that was, depending on how you look at defense spending for us, that was between 45 and 55% of the cost of our forces on the peninsula. Not to mention the fact that we're now at Camp Humphreys, our best military post overseas, which the ROKs paid 92% of, $10 billion. Not to mention the rail that they laid in there, the new rail, rail station that they're putting in for the convenience of our movement, our families' movements, etc. So they're a great ally who's paid, I think, as much as almost any ally we have in terms of burden sharing. So what's the problem? Well, we've asked them initially to increase their share fivefold from 1 billion to 5 billion. It's now down considerably from that because I think that was actually unrealistic, and the ROKs did as well, and I agree with them. I just think we need to come together and we need to settle this. Again, this isn't just about, this isn't about us defending the ROKs. This is about our own national interests as well. we have reasons for being there, as well as supporting a great ally. And so it has vital interest for both the ROK and the US, and we need to come to terms with that and settle on an agreeable sum.
We'll see the ROK Vice Foreign Minister is coming to DC later this week to meet with Steve Biegun. So maybe that will be a topic of discussion that they can hopefully hammer out.
I imagine it will be.
Fingers crossed. I'm sure it will be a topic of discussion. We'll see if they finalize it. A quick question, you sort of alluded to it, but people often ask it. COVID has disrupted military exercises, but they had been scaled down previous to that, surrounding some of the diplomatic efforts with North Korea. People are worried about the readiness, the effect on readiness this might have over time. So how important are the joint and combined military exercises that the alliance regularly holds, but has had to scale down really over the last 2 years?
Well, they're essential for our readiness being the alliance readiness. This is complex business, and we have to train together, and we have to train those who rotate in. So the ROK military rotates their senior leadership pretty regularly, and they also have a conscript military. So those personnel serve 18 to 22 months, depending on what service they're in and what their MOS is. We rotate troops, the majority of them at a year's time as well. So when you go, for any length of time without training, then you're beginning to impact the ability of that force to know each other well, to understand our processes and procedures, our cultures, and how to execute our plans. And so these exercises that we have are essential with the ROK US, and we need to get back to training, is what I would tell you as a military commander. Second point is just deterrence. I would highlight that North Korea does a very large series of training events, and they have not stopped doing theirs either. Very little coverage of that in the news, but they're consistent, they're constant, and for the very same reasons they do, we need to train as well.
We have another question here, often asked and an important one. What communication do we have with China about North Korea? And is that a viable avenue for helping with the issues, for helping with progressing in talks with North Korea?
Yeah, we do. We have, at the diplomatic level, we have communications. And up until recent times, we had military communications, military to military as well. Right now, that's with the heightened tensions with China, that's been constrained, and the communications have been pretty dramatically impacted. Having said that, I would tell you that I happen to be one that believes that communications are important all the time. Even during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, we had communications, we had a hotline, we talked. And for us, that's very important today with China, given our tensions, but it's important with respect to the peninsula. There's no doubt that China has vital interests with respect to stability on the peninsula as well, particularly North Korea. They're fully aware that North Korea has chemical and nuclear weapons too, and that it's a harm or a danger to them. We need to work together to bring this to a peaceful resolution, and understand that they have interests that are important to them, and work to realize those as well.
Turning to a question about, this is of course a little speculative, but it's often asked these days as well. It's widely anticipated that there will likely not be a meeting between Kim Jong-un and President Trump before the November election. Whoever is elected, though, how do you see the U.S. and North Korea talks and relations moving forward in the next presidential term, let's say in the next year, they've asked?
Yeah, so, as you said, it's speculative. I will tell you what I think. I think that this cycle of provocation is probably going to continue through the election period. I think that regardless of the administration elected or the president elected, we should keep the maximum pressure campaign up, but we should take a multinational approach. we have to include the regional allies. We have to include Russia and China and their national interests in order to bring this to a peaceful resolution. As I said, China really controls their trade, North Korea's trade, their monetary exchange. They have a lot of power with respect to Kim Jong-un's decisions. They're a critical part of bringing this forward without conflict. So I think those two things are key, regardless of the administration. I think, too, we have to return to exercises. We have to ensure that we've got a strong US-ROK alliance, that it remains strong, and that we, place a strong deterrence in place as well. And then finally, I think we need to be thinking about instability on the peninsula. This is something that's not discussed often, but I actually was concerned as a commander about instability that comes about through, famine. For instance, right now, Kim Jong-un is dealing with record monsoon floods, the worst crop that he's had in 10 years, and probably the worst economy that he's had in years and years in terms of the constraints by both COVID and the sanctions. And then, although he claims COVID has had no impact there, they don't have it. I doubt that. So, that could create instability on the peninsula. It could lead to a problem he can't resolve, or it could lead to a step by him to give his people something else to think about, all of which would lead to conflict in the peninsula and the region. So, I think that instability is another area that we need to be thinking about and planning for.
So you brought up a point that relates to another question that was asked, and that's regime stability or instability, and thinking about examples of other regimes historically collapsing. And there's a question that I believe is alluding to the GDR, East Germany. And how do you think the fall of East Germany affected North Korea's world outlook? And has it made the prospect for some form of diplomatic settlement, never high to begin with, virtually impossible?
Well, I think those, examples, and, Libya, for example, is another one, make this very difficult because Kim Jong-un, his first vital interest is survival of the regime, right? I mean, that's it. And if you look at the extent that he goes to ensure that, a very large security force, he is consistently rotating senior leadership to ensure that it's loyal to him. I don't know, Dr. Work, what's he on? Maybe his 6th or 7th or 8th Minister of Defense since 2011 when he took over? I lost count. But that's a part of what he does to ensure that he has absolute control. What I mentioned about the military and the information processes that he has to keep strong, that's all a part of this because he fears that there could be a revolt by the people. But I think given Korea's absolute control of their country, it would be difficult to have a bottoms-up kind of revolution. By the same token, I think, yes, he fears it. And yes, he fears that if he begins to negotiate, that it would not come out positive for him. And we've just got to simply work through some assurances of that for him and his regime.
So thinking about North Korea's sort of outward perspective, you mentioned, I think rightfully so, that the highest order priorities, regime stability, control of information, making sure the military and security services that are essential to regime control remain in place and robust. What about Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime's intent or desire to unify the peninsula under North Korean auspices? Of course, historically, and the Korean War is the most overt example, this has been North Korea's stated goal, one of its sort of ultimate objectives. Do you think this is still a realistic intent of theirs?
Well, I think it's one that Kim Jong-un still has as their prime objective, reunification under North Korean leadership. I think he's going about it differently. That's one of the reasons I think that building a nuclear and a missile capability is very important to him. That it is one way, perhaps, of bringing that about, particularly if he can break the U.S. and the South Korean alliance. But it's still stated in their, annual New Year's message as one of their ultimate goal is reunification. So we have to take them at their word at this point.
So looking at maybe taking ourselves back to just before the Hanoi summit, for example, there was quite a lot of discussion about one potential outcome being not a peace treaty, but a declaration ending the Korean War, sort of a political statement and declaration. What are your thoughts about the viability or the effectiveness or whether it's worthwhile to pursue such a declaration ending the Korean War? One of our attendees has asked about a peace treaty, but before we even get to that, what do you think about a declaration ending the Korean War?
Well, just a declaration in and of itself to me is not of much use because we clearly have conflict and we have a very aggressive force that really hasn't changed their behavior all that much through the course of the negotiations. They haven't done another nuclear test, but they have started doing their missile tests again, and we believe they do have the capability for an intercontinental ballistic missile. So, from my point of view, is that declaring an end to the war in and of itself, without some other steps that give assurances that we're backing away from conflict, would not be useful. It would probably give the perception of perhaps a positive step, but realistically, between the armed opponents there, it wouldn't appear to me to be that much of a good thing.
I might quickly assert moderator privilege and ask a question that's sort of near and dear to some of my own research projects, and that's about the specific number of U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula. And it's generally cited that there are about 28,500 U.S. troops there today. The president has spoke about possibly about wanting to pull some out without any specific numbers mentioned. Do you think we need that many, 28.5? And what do you think the potential consequences would be of some reductions or realignments of existing forces on the peninsula?
So, I'm not wed to 28.5 necessarily, other than the fact that that's what we said we would have there. And I think if you deviate from that, then it needs to be an alliance decision. There shouldn't be a unilateral one. That's very important because it's a part of, being a partner in this alliance. So if it's an alliance decision to change, whether it's to raise it or reduce it, then that's the appropriate means to go about it. And the second reason I say that is this is really not about numbers. It's about capabilities. And within the alliance, we know pretty well what capabilities we have and what we need to build and who's providing them. That will change over time. And as I said, technology is changing the character of war. So I suspect that, the numbers can change over time. But what's important is understanding the capabilities that are required. Now, having said that, I want to underscore the reason that's important. This is a conflict, as I said, with forces in place. If something were to start, it could ramp up very quickly. And for that reason, there is a specific foundation in ROK U.S. forces that you need to have in place immediately in order to establish the conditions you need to then both mobilize their force and move our forces into place that we would deploy. And so there is a certain foundation, and that drives, those numbers, but it should be based basically on capability and not number of people.
Yeah, really interesting and crucial question. Well, would that we had more time to dig into these obviously complex issues. But unfortunately, we don't have too much more. And before I pass things off for a closing statement, I just wanted to again reiterate how appreciative we are to you, General Scaparrotti, for taking the time to join us and to discuss the nature and importance of the connection between the U.S. and the Korean Peninsula. And it's an enduring one, and one that, as you put so well, is even more important as we think about the shifting strategic context and world that we currently face. Sort of COVID has reinforced this. So thank you again for joining us. I do now want to pass things off to a board member of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, Colonel Bob Holcomb, who is a colonel in the 82nd Airborne, also stationed at Fort Bragg, where I understand the general was stationed for the better part of. I'm sorry.
All Americans.
The All Americans, is that the name? Was also part of the All Americans. So we want to pass things off to him for a closing statement on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. And again, thank you very much to the council for their partnership and wonderful outreach efforts. Colonel Holcomb.
Thank you very much, Clint. I really appreciate it. As Clint mentioned, I'm Bob Holcomb, a board member of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, retired Army Corps of Engineers officer. And on behalf of the board, I want to thank General Scaparrotti for his service to our country and on the politics, providing his insight on the politics and strategy that govern U.S. foreign policy towards the Korean Peninsula. I'd like to thank our members and viewers for attending this web-based event and supporting the programs of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. And if you're not already a member of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, you should be, because we do bring you rather pertinent and timely discussions to the landscape that affects all of our lives. So I want to thank you all for attending this web-based event, and I hope to see you again at one of our future World Affairs Council events. And thank you very much, Clint and General Scaparrotti. I appreciate it. I had a good time with the 82nd like you did, and we certainly share that common bond of Fort Bragg. So thank you very much for everything you've done for our country.
Thank you, Bob, for the invitation, and to LJ, thank you as well, and to the Global Affairs Council there. And Dr. Work, thanks. I enjoyed doing this with you.
Likewise. And just to reiterate, we'll have the video up on Stimson's website, as will the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, with whom we will share the video. So it will live on in perpetuity. One of the silver linings, I suppose, of COVID is we've gotten now all this virtual material. Well, take care, everybody.
Thank you.